Police kicked in the door expecting a drug lord. Guns raised, adrenaline high, prepared for violence. Instead, they found a grandmother in an apron standing calmly in a small apartment kitchen surrounded by brownies. Not a few, 54 dozen of them. 18 pounds of marijuana sat nearby, enough to trigger felony charges in the middle of the war on drugs, enough to put someone away for years. The woman didn't scream, she didn't run, she didn't deny anything. She looked at the officers, completely composed, and said, "I thought you were coming." That woman was 57 years old, and within the next decade, she would help change American law, not through political office, money, or influence, but by feeding dying men, doing the one thing the government insisted was illegal. She wasn't selling drugs to get rich. She wasn't exploiting addiction. She was easing pain in hospital wards that no one even wanted to enter. This is the story of Brownie Mary. I'm Brittany Ransom, and this is When Killers Get Caught, a podcast where we dig into the lives, behavior, and psychology behind the most extreme crimes and what happens after the truth comes out. Today's episode is different because Mary Jane Rathbun never killed anyone, but the United States government treated her like she did. And that tells us everything we need to know about fear, power, and who the law is really built to protect. In 1981, San Francisco police believed they were shutting down a serious drug operation. This was the height of the war on drugs, a period defined by numbers, arrests, seizures, quantities. Marijuana wasn't treated as a minor offense or a medical question, it was framed as a threat, a gateway drug that justified aggressive reinforcement. Police departments across the country were under pressure to prove they were winning. And in San Francisco, that meant targeting anyone distributing cannabis in bulk. So when officers received information about a woman producing and distributing large quantities of marijuana-infused brownies out of her apartment, it was taken fairly seriously. This wasn't casual use. This was considered manufacturing. This was distribution. This was a felony. When police arrived, they expected secrecy, nervous glances, hurried movements, maybe denial. Instead, the door opened to the unmistakable smell of chocolate. Not faint or subtle, thick and warm, the scent of something homemade. And inside the apartment, on cooling racks that lined the counters, baking pans sat neatly arranged. Brownies, dozens upon dozens of them, laid out with care, waiting to be wrapped and delivered. Nothing about this scene suggested chaos or criminality. It looked like a kitchen in the middle of a routine. But that cannabis found was enough to support felony charges. It was enough to justify the raid and enough to send someone to prison. But what stood out the most to the officers had nothing to do with the drugs. It was Mary. Mary Jane Rathbun was in her late 50s, short, well-spoken, soft-spoken, and grandmotherly in appearance. She didn't resemble the kind of person police had been trained to expect in these kinds of cases. Her posture was relaxed, her tone was calm. She didn't even attempt to explain herself or talk her way out of it. She just stood in her kitchen as officers cataloged evidence, behaving like someone who already understood the consequences and had accepted them. The arrest itself was very straightforward, but the media response was immediate. Newspapers seized on the novelty of the story. A grandmother drug dealer, a rogue waitress, a brownie baker turned felon. In a decade marked by violent drug raids and grim headlines, Mary's case was treated like an oddity, almost charming. The coverage leaned into the contrast: brownies instead of bricks, a kind old woman instead of a hardened criminal, a kitchen instead of a street corner. But the jokes all missed the point. Mary Jane Rathbun wasn't running a business. She wasn't making a profit. She wasn't selling drugs for recreation or status. She was responding to suffering. To understand why Mary was baking cannabis brownies at all, we have to go back to San Francisco in the early 80s. See, the city was the epicenter of a growing medical crisis that few people even wanted to acknowledge. Young men were getting sick, quickly, inexplicably, their immune systems collapsing, rare infections appeared, bodies wasting away. Doctors didn't know what caused it. There was no cure, no effective treatment, and little urgency from federal officials. The disease didn't even have a name yet. They called it GRID. It would eventually be called AIDS, but in 1981, it existed mostly as fear, rumor, and stigma. Hospitals filled with patients who were often treated like hazards rather than human beings. Some families refused to visit. Some healthcare workers avoided physical contact. Pain went untreated. The nausea was relentless. Many patients simply stopped eating. Mary saw this up close. Before the headlines, before the arrests, Mary was just a waitress and a baker. Feeding people was her livelihood and her instinct. When friends became ill, she visited them in hospitals and apartments, and she watched something heartbreaking unfold. Food trays left untouched, bodies growing weaker by the day. People wanted to eat. They needed to eat, but the pain, anxiety, and nausea made it almost impossible. Mary knew that cannabis could stimulate appetite and ease discomfort. She didn't arrive at that knowledge through policy debates or medical trials. It was just observation, through trial and error, through care. So she started baking. Quietly at first, carefully, she infused brownies with marijuana and brought them to her friends who were sick. The effect was immediate and undeniable. People who hadn't eaten in days asked for more. People in constant pain relaxed enough to finally rest. Food became possible again. Word spread, not through advertising, but through necessity, through hospital rooms, through whispered recommendations between patients who had largely been abandoned by the medical system. Mary didn't operate like a dealer either. She never set prices. She didn't push product. Often, she refused payment entirely. When she accepted donations, it was to cover the ingredients or her transportation, never profit. By the time the police knocked on her door in 81, Mary had already helped countless people. She also understood the risk. Marijuana was illegal. Distribution carried serious penalties. The war on drugs didn't care about your intent. Mary baked anyway. That's why she wasn't surprised when the police arrived. That's why she didn't panic. She had already weighed the consequences against suffering that she was witnessing, and she had chosen her side. The calm she displayed during that raid, it unsettled people. Police expected fear. Reporters expected shame. The public expected guilt. But Mary offered none of it. She never framed herself as a victim of circumstance or claimed ignorance of the law. She believed deeply that what she was doing was right. And for the media, that posed a problem. It's easy to mock a grandmother with brownies, and it's harder to reconcile that her crime was feeding people who are dying while medical institutions look the other way. If Mary was a criminal, then the law was punishing compassion. If Mary was wrong, then people were suffering needlessly. And if Mary was right, if cannabis was easing pain when medicine couldn't, then the system wasn't just ineffective, it was cruel. That first raid didn't stop Mary Jane Rathbun. It didn't silence her work or end her resolve. Instead, it exposed a moral contradiction that would grow more uncomfortable as the AIDS crisis worsened. The media may have tried to turn her into a punchline, but Mary wasn't laughing. And neither were any of the people that she fed. Mary Jane Rathbun wasn't born a rebel by accident. She was born on December 22nd, 1922, in Chicago, Illinois, into a world defined by rules about gender, obedience, faith, and silence. Her mother was a conservative Irish Catholic woman who believed deeply in order and propriety. The name Mary Jane was chosen with reverence, not irony. It was meant to reflect faith, purity, and tradition. No one could have guessed how profoundly that name would one day clash with authority. Mary spent much of her childhood in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where she was sent to Catholic school. The environment was rigid and hierarchical. Discipline wasn't questioned, it was enforced. Obedience wasn't encouraged, it was demanded. Girls were taught, be quiet, grateful, and compliant. Virtues presented as moral truths rather than simply social expectations. Mary did not do well under those conditions. Even as a child, she showed an instinctive resistance to unquestioned authority. She wasn't loud for the sake of being loud, and she was never cruel, but she bristled at punishment she felt was unjust. She asked why when she was expected to simply say yes. She challenged rules that didn't make sense to her lived experience. And that resistance came to a head when she was only 13 years old. During a disciplinary incident in school, a nun attempted to cane her, a punishment that at the time was considered acceptable and pretty much routine. Mary refused to submit. Instead of lowering her head, she fought back physically. A teenage girl striking a nun was unthinkable in that world. It was scandalous, it was dangerous, and it marked Mary immediately as a problem. But that wasn't an isolated moment of teenage rebellion. It was a declaration, one she was going to repeat in different forms for the rest of her life. Mary didn't believe authority was sacred simply because it existed. She believed you had to earn it. She believed it had to be earned legitimately through fairness and compassion. And when it didn't, she felt no obligation to comply. By her teenage years, Mary had already left home. She was supporting herself the way countless working class women did in the 20th century, waitressing. The work was physically demanding, poorly paid, and often invisible, but it gave Mary something invaluable: proximity to people. Waitressing meant listening, it meant observing human behavior up close. It meant learning who was kind under pressure and who just wasn't. It meant seeing how exhaustion, hunger, grief, and loneliness shaped people's lives. Mary would spend most of her adult life on her feet, carrying plates and refilling coffee cups, absorbing stories without judgment. Long before she ever set foot in an AIDS ward, she understood suffering, not as an abstract concept, but as something that sat across from her at a table every day. Even then, activism pulled at her. So, while Mary was still young, she traveled from Chicago to Wisconsin to campaign for miners' rights to unionize. This was very dangerous work. Labor organizing in the 40s wasn't romantic. It was met with threats, intimidation, and outright violence. But Mary believed deeply that workers deserved protection and dignity, especially those risking their lives underground. Later in Minneapolis, she became involved in abortion rights activism. This wasn't a popular cause at the time. It was not a safe position to hold. In the 40s and early 50s, advocating for abortion could cost a woman her reputation, her job, or worse. It was discussed in whispers, if at all, but Mary spoke up anyway. She saw women harmed by back alley procedures. She saw lives destroyed by shame and silence. And once again, she found herself at odds with laws that punished the vulnerable rather than protecting them. Long before those brownies, long before the AIDS wards, and long before police raids, Mary was pushing against systems that enforced morality without compassion. During World War II, like many Americans drawn west by opportunity and uncertainty, Mary moved to San Francisco. This city was changing rapidly, shaped by war, migration, and possibility. At a USO dance, she met a man. They married quickly, a decision made in a moment of hope and momentum. The marriage didn't last, though. What did last was their daughter. Peggy was born in 1955, and she became Mary's center of gravity. For all of Mary's toughness and defiance and refusal to bend, Peggy softened her. Mary was fiercely devoted, protective, and deeply present as a mother. Friends later described her as both loving and vigilant, the kind of parent who watched the world closely, aware of how it could harm someone very young. Years later, while seeking something quieter, Mary moved to Reno, Nevada. She worked, she tried to build stability, and she tried in her own way to simply rest. But in the early 70s, everything collapsed. Peggy was killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. She was just 22 years old. The loss was devastating. It wasn't just grief, it was disorientation. Parents aren't supposed to outlive their children. The world no longer made sense to Mary in the same way. Friends would later say the loss marked a permanent shift inside of her. It didn't harden her into bitterness, though. It sharpened her compassion. Mary became fiercely protective of anyone young, vulnerable, sick, or abandoned. She had lost the person she loved the most, and she refused to watch others be discarded by systems that could have helped them. When Mary eventually returned to San Francisco, she carried more than grief. She carried a lifetime of lived injustice, of standing up and being punished for it, of watching institutions fail the people they claim to serve. So when she walked into an AIDS ward, no one else would even enter. When she fed young men, no one else would touch. When she broke laws she believed were wrong, this wasn't a sudden transformation. She hadn't been radicalized. This was just continuity. Mary Jane Rathbun didn't wake up one day and decide to become Brownie Mary. She became her because she had always been someone who resisted authority when it caused harm and stepped in when no one else would. By the time that history noticed her, she was already exactly who she'd been building herself to be her entire life. The Shanty Project and San Francisco General Hospital were ground zero for a crisis no one wanted to touch. In the early 90s, AIDS was still a medical mystery. Doctors didn't know who caused it, they didn't know how it spread, they didn't know how to stop it, but what they did know was that it was killing young men, and fast. Patients arrived with symptoms no one could explain: rare infections, sudden weight loss, lesions blooming across their skin, immune systems collapsing under what should have been manageable illnesses. It moved quickly, and it did not forgive. Fear filled the hospitals as much as the sickness did. Nurses worried about physical contact. Some wore multiple layers of gloves. Others kept their distance entirely. Food trays were left outside rooms. Linens went unchanged longer than they should have. It wasn't always cruelty. Often it was terror fueled by misinformation and a lack of guidance. Families simply vanished. Parents refused to visit, ashamed or afraid of what this diagnosis implied. Partners were barred from hospital rooms because the relationships weren't legally recognized. Friends were shut out. Many patients died surrounded by strangers if they weren't alone entirely. The Shanty Project emerged to fill that void. Founded to provide emotional and practical support to people with terminal illnesses, Shanty volunteers sat with patients when no one else would. They listened, they cleaned, they held hands, and they bore witness. Mary Jane Rathbun joined without hesitation. She didn't approach the AIDS wards like a hero or a martyr. She approached it like a woman who had spent her life responding to need. Where others saw risk, she just saw abandonment. Where others hesitated, she stepped forward. Mary never wore protective gear, not because she was reckless, but because she refused to let fear dictate how she treated people. She didn't hover in doorways, she didn't flinch from touch. She looked these men in the eye, many of them barely older than her daughter would have been. That mattered to her. She cleaned rooms that hadn't been cleaned in days, changed sheets stiff with sweat, sat at bedsides when pain spiked or breathing was difficult. She listened to stories that had nowhere to go. Stories of love, of fear, of anger, of unfinished lives. She became for many patients the last consistent presence that they knew. And she noticed something that medicine seemed unable or unwilling to fix. The medications these men were on were brutal. Early age treatment and experimental drugs tore through a patient's digestive system. Nausea was constant, vomiting frequent, appetite gone. Even when food was available, they just couldn't keep it down. Bodies wasted away not only from the disease, but from starvation. Mary watched men grow weaker, not just because they were sick, but because they couldn't eat. She watched untouched trays taken away every day. She watched the weight fall off bodies already struggling to survive, and she had seen this before. Years earlier, in quieter settings, she had already learned that cannabis could ease nausea and stimulate appetite. She had watched it help people when nothing else would. She didn't need a study to tell her what her eyes already knew. So she started bringing brownies. At first, it was discreet, a small offering, a suggestion. She never framed it as medicine, just food. But the results were immediate. Men who hadn't eaten in days were suddenly asking for more food. Men whose pain kept them curled up, relaxed enough to talk to Mary. Some laughed, a sound that had become rare in these hallways. Others simply slept deeply for the first time in weeks. But the food stayed down. The strength returned, even if it was only for a brief moment. Dignity came back into those hospital rooms. And word spread quickly, the way it does in places where relief is scarce. Patients talked to each other. Volunteers noticed. Nurses, some quietly, some reluctantly, acknowledged the change. Mary never asked for credit, and she definitely didn't ask for permission. She just kept showing up. She baked in her apartment late into the night, wrapped the brownies carefully, and delivered them where they were needed most. She navigated hospital hallways with the confidence of someone who belonged there. Not because the institution welcomed her, but because the patients did. And for many of those men, Mary became their family. She remembered their names, their favorite flavors, who liked music played softly, and who preferred silence. She held their hands during bad nights. She sat through their final breaths. And when patients died, Mary mourned them, even when no one else showed up. This was not safe work. The fear surrounding AIDS was intense and relentless. Volunteers were warned. Friends questioned her choices. Strangers judged her openly. She was told repeatedly, "You're risking your life." But Mary didn't deny the risk. She didn't believe that fear justified abandonment. She'd already lost her daughter. She understood loss intimately. And she refused to let fear strip other people of human connection in their final days. To Mary, these men weren't statistics or symbols. They weren't moral lessons or cautionary tales. They were people who were sick and hungry and scared. So she fed them. But the law at the time, it didn't care about intent. Cannabis was illegal. Distribution is a crime. Hospitals were under scrutiny. Volunteers were expected to follow rules that prioritized liability over compassion. Mary broke those rules deliberately. Not loudly or publicly, but consistently. She believed a law that forced people to suffer unnecessarily wasn't moral at all. And she'd already spent the first part of her life pushing back against it. By the time the authorities started paying attention, Mary was already deeply embedded in the AIDS community. She was trusted, relied upon, and essential. And she walked straight into fear every single day. She walked past the stigma, judgment, and danger. She walked into rooms where people were dying alone and made sure they weren't. But she never saw herself as brave. She saw herself as present. And in a crisis defined by absence of answers, of support, of compassion, presence was everything. Now, cannabis wasn't new to Mary Jane. She had used it herself long before it became the center of her life's work. She knew it softened pain without numbing the spirit. She knew how it calmed the stomach, brought back appetite, and allowed sleep to come without the sharp edge of suffering. Her understanding wasn't theoretical, but practical, earned through experience and observation. So she watched men in those AIDS wards waste away, and she didn't debate the issue. She simply made a decision, went home, turned on the oven. Mary was living on Social Security, though. She had no savings, no inheritance, and no financial buffer. Her life was modest to the point of almost scarcity. Every dollar she had went into these ingredients: the flour, sugar, butter, cocoa. Baking wasn't a side project. This was an act of redistribution. What little she had, she poured into food for people who had even less. And then the cannabis came quietly. Growers heard what Mary was doing through word of mouth. Just community awareness. People who cultivated marijuana understood exactly what she needed, and they donated without any expectation or fanfare. They didn't ask for recognition or money. They understood the assignment, and every day, Mary baked. Her apartment became a pretty functional production line, though nothing about it was industrial. The pans moved from counter to oven to cooling racks in steady rotation, smell of chocolate filling the space. She worked methodically, never hurried, never sloppy. Precision mattered here, consistency mattered. Patients needed predictable relief. Once cooled, the brownies were carefully portioned and wrapped. She packed them in baskets, not bags or boxes. Baskets. That presentation mattered to her. This wasn't contraband, it was care. Then she left her apartment, took public transportation to the hospital. She moved through San Francisco with the calm of someone just running an errand, because that's what it felt like to her. This wasn't rebellion just for rebellion's sake. It was a routine. And then inside the hospital, Mary moved from room to room. She never rushed. She never snuck around. She didn't act like she was doing anything wrong. Her confidence was quiet and often disarming. And then she would sit with the patients, talk to them, touch them, mother them. "Here, baby," she would say softly, "eat this. It'll help." And it did. Men, unable to keep food down, started eating again. For some patients, the brownies were the only thing that worked to ease their pain. Nurses noticed, at first quietly, then openly. Patients who had been declining stabilized. Moods lifted. Some patients began gaining small amounts of weight. Not enough to cure them, but enough to give them some strength. And the doctors noticed too. Not all of them approved. Some of them were cautious and some were outright hostile. The law was clear, and hospitals are the law was clear, risk-averse institutions. But even skeptics couldn't deny the visible changes in the ward. The atmosphere shifted. Laughter returned to rooms where silence had dominated. Conversations lasted longer. Patients engaged with each other. This was less like a holding space for death and more like a medical ward where people were still living. But Mary didn't take credit. She never framed herself as a savior. She just went back home and kept baking. As word spread, demand grew. The patients asked for more brownies. More volunteers sought her out. More people donated ingredients when they could. Mary's work expanded organically. She remained deeply aware that what she was doing was illegal. but that legality had stopped being her moral compass as a child. She had spent her life watching laws fail the people they were supposed to protect. Seeing workers crushed for organizing, women punished for controlling their own bodies, sick people abandoned because they were simply inconvenient. To Mary, a law that criminalized relief was not a law worth respecting, and she was willing to accept the consequences. Hospital administration became aware of her presence. Some tolerated, some tried to limit it, some warned her outright. And Mary always listened politely. And then she would come back the next day with more brownies. This defiance was fueled by care. Mary never raised her voice or protested outside hospital doors. She just refused to stop. These brownies became more than just food. They became a symbol of dignity in a system that was stripping it away. They became proof that relief was possible if compassion led the way. It was a quiet indictment of a medical establishment constrained by fear and policy. Mary understood that she was visible now and that arrest was inevitable, but she baked anyway, because every brownie represented a choice to ease pain rather than obey an unjust law. The brownies changed that ward, and it also changed Mary's life permanently. What began as an instinctive response to suffering had become an act of civil disobedience, one that she repeated every single day without apology. Mary Jane Rathbun didn't believe she was breaking the law. She believed the law had already broken faith with the dying, and she wasn't going to let that be the final word. They started calling her Brownie Mary. At first, it was said affectionately, almost playfully, a way to identify the woman everyone seemed to know. Brownie Mary became shorthand in hospital corridors and volunteer circles, a familiar presence spoken with relief and gratitude. Over time, that name followed her everywhere. For over a decade, Mary Jane Rathbun was a fixture in San Francisco's AIDS community, baking constantly, hundreds of brownies every day. Her apartment functioning on a rhythm dictated by need. The oven rarely resting. Counters always dusted with flour. Smell of chocolate became permanent and embedded in the walls. But the brownies were only a part of what she gave. She also washed clothes for patients who were too weak to do it themselves, sat through long afternoons when conversation drifted between memory and fear. She attended their funerals because their families wouldn't come. She learned how to sit quietly during final breaths, how to hold a hand without trying to fill the silence. She never asked questions about how they lived their lives. She didn't interrogate their choices. She didn't moralize things. She just didn't want to let them die alone. For many patients, Mary was the only constant presence they had. Partners were actually barred by hospital policy, which is something that still stands today. If you are just a romantic partner of someone who is dying, you don't actually have a right to be in their hospital room when they die. It tends to defer to parents and spouses, which is why the LGBT community in America fought so hard to be able to get married so that they could give family dignity when it was time to die. There were so many people who died alone because of this policy. Not to mention, a lot of these people were estranged by their families just to begin with. Being gay, especially 70 years ago, was not a good time. You were very likely to lose everyone you had known simply for who you were. Once people were discovered to have grid, what they called it originally, friends disappeared under the weight of that fear. Volunteers rotated in and out. Mary was the only one who stayed consistently over a decade. She remembered their birthdays. She brought them clean socks, their favorite snacks, music on portable radios. She talked to the patients about their lives before they got sick. She listened without flinching when the anger and the grief spilled out. She was their surrogate mother, sister, aunt, whatever role was needed at the time. And in the return, the community protected her as best it could. Donations appeared anonymously. Volunteers helped with deliveries. Nurses quietly looked the other way. Doctors couldn't officially endorse her work, but they did acknowledge its impact privately. Brownie Mary wasn't just tolerated, she was relied upon. However, outside the hospital walls, the world was hardening and the war on drugs was escalating through the 80s and early 90s with renewed ferocity. Mandatory minimum sentences expanded, law enforcement budgets grew, the rhetoric became more punitive, more moralistic, and much less forgiving. Compassion disappeared from policy language entirely. Cannabis, regardless of context, was criminal. Medical use was dismissed at all. Patients were collateral damage in a war defined by optics rather than outcomes. And Mary was painfully aware of this. She had already been arrested multiple times for possession of marijuana and distribution, and each arrest was treated by authorities as a chance to stop what she was doing. And every single time, she resumed baking as soon as she could. The arrests didn't slow down the demand, and it definitely didn't change the reality inside the AIDS ward. If anything, it highlighted the absurdity of punishing a woman whose crime was feeding dying people. By the early 1990s, Mary's visibility made her impossible to ignore. She was no longer just a volunteer slipping quietly through hallways. She was a symbol, whether she wanted to be or not. A living contradiction to a drug war narrative, a reminder that rigid laws produce cruel outcomes. And the government does not like a symbol it can't control. In 1992, they came for Mary again. This time, it wasn't treated like a minor offense or an oddity. They framed it as a serious crime. The quantities involved were significant, and the charges carried real consequences. The tone had shifted from bemusement to enforcement. Mary was arrested again for marijuana distribution. This time she was 70 years old, and the public reaction was swift. By then, the AIDS crisis had forced itself into national consciousness. Too many people had died, too many families losing sons, brothers, partners. Activism was louder, angrier, and much more organized. Mary's arrest didn't land quietly this time. Support poured in from patients, volunteers, healthcare workers, activists. People who were fed by those brownies spoke publicly. Doctors acknowledged the relief that she provided. Advocates framed her work not as criminal, but as compassionate care. Mary didn't retreat, and she never expressed regret. She didn't even argue that she was being misunderstood. She simply said, "This is necessary," making it clear that she would continue baking as long as people needed her, law or no law, framing her actions openly as civil disobedience. If law required suffering, she would break that law. Her courtroom appearances became these moments of confrontation between rigid policy and lived reality. The prosecutors spoke of statutes and law enforcement, but the supporters spoke about hunger, pain, and dignity. And Mary simply stood calmly in the center of it all. She was not a theatrical woman. She didn't shout slogans. She wasn't seeking celebrity, but her presence carried a certain weight. A 17 a 70-year-old woman who had spent a decade feeding the dying did not fit neatly into the image of a criminal threat. The contrast made people uncomfortable, and that discomfort, it mattered. Mary's arrest became a part of a broader conversation about medical marijuana, one that lawmakers could no longer dismiss as simply fringe. Patients demanded access. Doctors said, "We need flexibility." Activists demanded change. And begrudgingly, the conversation shifted. Mary continued working, even as her own health declined. She moved more slowly now, needed help carrying all her baskets, but she stayed involved, present, and committed. She outlived most of the men she cared for. She attended memorials that blended together, names stacking up faster than the grief could process it. She mourned deeply, but she never stopped, because stopping would have meant accepting a world where fear dictated care. And Mary just couldn't accept that. By the time Brownie Mary became known across the entire country, it was no longer just a quaint little nickname. This was defiant. It represented a woman who had chosen compassion repeatedly, even when she was punished for it. A woman who fed people when the system failed. Mary Jane never set out to become a symbol. She set out to simply feed people, but history made the rest of the decision for her. At nearly 70 years old, Mary Jane Rathbun was arrested again. This time, not an inconvenience or odd footnote. These charges were serious: felony distribution, repeat offenses, possibility of real prison time hung over her in a way that it never had before. To prosecutors, Mary was very simple to categorize. She was a repeat offender. She had been warned, arrested, given every opportunity to stop, and yet she continued in the language of the war on drugs that made her defiant. The law never recognizes context, and it often doesn't recognize intention. The law recognizes patterns, and Mary's pattern was fairly clear. To the San Francisco AIDS community, however, Mary was something else entirely. This constance during the decade defined by laws, while politicians debated and institutions stalled, Mary was there. By the early 1990s, she wasn't just a volunteer, she was family. When news of that arrest broke, there was immediate outrage. Doctors were writing letters about the medical necessity of marijuana. Nurses testified about patients regaining appetite only after eating her brownies. Social workers spoke about the psychological impact of the comfort she offered people, the way that her presence alone would ease fear. Parents stepped forward. Some were people who had been too ashamed or afraid to visit their own sons in the hospital. They spoke about a woman who had held their children's hands when they could not, the woman who treated them with dignity when stigma stripped it away. Mary listened to all of it quietly, her only argument that the law was wrong. In her interview, she spoke very plainly. She never sanitized her language or softened her resolve. When asked whether this arrest would finally make her stop, she looked directly into the camera and said, "If the narcs think I'm going to stop baking brownies for my kids with AIDS, they can go fuck themselves in a Macy's window." That quote went national. It appeared in newspapers, on television, on radio programs across the country. Some people were shocked by the profanity, and others were stunned by the clarity. Here was a grandma, gray haired, blunt, unapologetic, daring the government to justify itself. And the government couldn't justify anything. The optics here were disastrous. On one side stood the state, invoking statutes and enforcement policies and priorities. On the other was a 70-year-old lady who had simply been feeding people. There was no violence in the case, no profit, no exploitation, only brownies and grief. Public scrutiny intensified. The activists began to rally. Medical marijuana advocates pointed to Mary as proof that policy was lagging dangerously beyond reality. Journalists revisited the AIDS crisis and the ways that the government neglect had forced this community to care for itself. Even people who supported strict drug laws began to hesitate because this felt different. It forced a question that couldn't be avoided. What exactly was justice supposed to look like here? Inside the courtroom, though, the contrast was stark. Prosecutors described Mary's repeated violations calmly and methodically. They emphasized the amount of cannabis involved. They argued that allowing exceptions would undermine the rule of the law. But Mary's supporters spoke about pain, about people who couldn't eat, about nights spent holding hands when no one else would, about brownies that meant the difference between suffering and relief. Mary remained steadfast throughout all of the legal proceedings. She never postured, she never pled. She accepted the possibility that she might actually go to jail, not because she believed she deserved it, but because she understood how the legal system worked. She just refused to recant. To stop baking would mean admitting the state had the moral high ground, and she didn't believe that for a second. As the case began to unfold publicly, it was increasingly clear that prosecution came at a cost. Every hearing was drawing more attention. Every news segment invited another wave of public support or criticism. The more the state pressed, the more Mary's work was scrutinized, and they were expecting negativity, but in fact, she just got praise. This case could not survive the public scrutiny, but dropping the charges wasn't framed as an admission of wrongdoing by the state. It was, in fact, a retreat. The narrative had escaped their control. Mary was no longer a defendant. She was a symbol for the people, not of lawlessness, but that there was a moral gap, a place where rigid policy failed and human compassion had to step in. And right after the case was dropped, Mary returned to her work, baking, visiting hospitals, continuing to care for people with AIDS, even as new treatments slowly emerged and the crisis started to shift. She never softened her stance, never reframed her actions as unfortunate necessities. These were choices, deliberate, informed, and necessary. In the years that followed, Mary's influence rippled outward, and her case became part of the foundation for San Francisco's medical marijuana movement. She worked alongside the activists and advocates who pushed for formal recognition of cannabis as medicine. And eventually, those efforts bore fruit. Fortunately, Mary did not live to see the full arc of change. She died in 1999 at the age of 77. By then, the world started to catch up to what she had known all along, that relief matters, that dignity matters, and that laws divorced from human reality do real harm. Mary Jane Rathbun never wanted to be famous. She just wanted people to eat. She just wanted people to sleep. She wanted them to feel cared for when the world told them they were disposable. The state saw a criminal, but San Francisco just saw a grandmother. History remembers a woman who stood between fear and compassion and chose compassion every single time. Unfortunately, though, there was a time period where Mary Jane had to stop baking. But during that time period, she decided to start organizing. For years, her work had existed in the margins, tolerated, overlooked, quietly relied upon, but the state had made it clear that they would actually never really leave her alone. The arrests, the courtroom battles, the threats of prison were never mistakes. Those were warnings. If she wanted real protection for the people she loved, the system had to change. And that was brought to her attention with a partnership with Dennis Perrin. Perrin was a Vietnam vet, an outspoken cannabis activist, and a fixture in San Francisco's counterculture politics. Where Mary was maternal and steady, Perrin was confrontational and unapologetic. They were a good duo. He spoke the language of rights and resistance. Together, they formed something unprecedented. It was called the San Francisco Cannabis Buyers Club, the first public medical cannabis dispensary in the United States, open, visible, and deliberately illegal. This was not a hidden operation, no whispers, no back alleys. Patients were allowed to walk through the front door. Caregivers would speak openly, and the building itself became a statement. People were sick, cannabis helped them, and criminalizing that reality was indefensible. And Mary worked behind the counter. She didn't look like an activist. She didn't look like a revolutionary. She looked like somebody's grandma, and that mattered. She greeted these patients warmly, remembered almost everyone's name. She always asked how people were feeling. She explained the dosages in the way that a nurse might, with care and seriousness, and that presence often disarmed people. Opponents expected chaos, but what they saw was order. They expected recklessness, and instead there was responsibility. They expected criminals, but all they saw were caregivers. The Buyers Club became a sanctuary, and people living with AIDS, cancer patients, individuals with chronic pain, epilepsy, wasting syndromes, Mary Many had exhausted conventional treatment options. Some had been turned away by doctors unwilling to simply risk association. But at the Buyers Club, they weren't questioned and everyone was welcome. Of course, the state of California noticed and raids followed. People got arrested again. The Buyers Club existed in constant tension with law enforcement, honestly. But the difference now was visibility. Every attempt to shut it down created backlash. Every raid reinforced the question that officials couldn't answer. Why are we punishing sick people just trying to survive? Mary didn't frame the fight in abstract terms. She always argued about people. And when she campaigned for Proposition 215, she never used an ideology. There was no discussion of the drug war or philosophy or libertarian principles. She just told stories. She talked about pain and hunger and young people dying alone in hospital beds. It was plain and blunt, the way she'd always been. She never softened the reality for comfort. She didn't sanitize suffering to persuade people. She was talking about kids dying, and she talked about her brownies. To voters who had never stepped inside of an AIDS ward, Mary made the consequence of criminalization impossible to ignore. She didn't ask these people to like cannabis. She asked them, imagine being sick and denied relief. She asked them to imagine between breaking the law and watching someone suffer. She asked them what compassion looked like. And then, 1996, California voters approved Proposition 215, the Compassionate Use Act. For the first time in U.S. history, state law exempted certain patients and their primary caregivers from criminal liability for the possession and cultivation of marijuana, specifically for medicinal use. This was a very narrow victory. It was imperfect, but it was historic. The first domino had fallen. With the passage of Prop 215, however, it didn't end conflict. Federal law still classified cannabis as illegal, and that meant the raids could continue. Dispensaries operated in this legal gray zone. Patients remained vulnerable in a lot of ways, but the moral line was shifting. The state had acknowledged what Mary had always known: criminalizing care is wrong. There was no loud celebration from Mary. She simply returned to work. Continued advocating, continued supporting her patients, continued pushing for broader acceptance and protection. She knew that progress was fragile and that systems could backslide. But something fundamental had changed here. The conversation was no longer hypothetical. Cannabis was no longer just a drug in public discourse. It was medicine. Mary had helped force that recognition, not through power or influence, but just persistence. She lived long enough to see other states begin to follow California's lead, to see medical marijuana discussed seriously by doctors and lawmakers. As I said, she died in 1999 before the movement could fully mature, but the groundwork was laid. Every dispensary that followed, every patient protected by the law, every conversation that treats medical cannabis as legitimate care rather than moral failure, all of it traces back in part to a grandmother who just refused to stop baking. Mary Jane Rathbun started as a criminal in the eyes of the state, and she ended as an activist who would help change the laws everywhere. Not because she sought power, but because she refused to let suffering go unanswered. History often remembers movements as abstractions. This one, it smelled like chocolate. Mary Jane Rathbun died April 10th, 1999. She did not die wealthy. She did not leave behind property, investments, or savings accounts. She left no foundation bearing her name, no official title, no monuments carved into stone. But what she left behind was so much bigger. She died poor in money, but rich in legacy. Today, millions of people use medical cannabis legally in hospitals, hospice care, and in their own homes. For some, it means relief from chronic pain. For others, it means an appetite during chemotherapy, rest during long nights of illness, or dignity during the final stages of their life. Most of those people will never hear Mary's name. They won't know about the grandma who baked brownies in a tiny apartment. They don't know about the hospital wards filled with fear or the people abandoned because their illness made people uncomfortable. They won't know how close relief once was to being criminalized completely out of existence. But that relief exists because Mary refused to look away when suffering was easier to ignore, and because she didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for studies, legislation, or approval. She just responded to what she could see: hunger, pain, and loneliness. Mary's life is a reminder that authority does not automatically equal morality. Laws do not always reflect real justice, and sometimes obedience causes more harm than defiance ever could. She showed us that compassion isn't loud, it isn't glamorous. It often looks like repetition, baking again, showing up again, holding another hand, walking into fear, day in and day out. Mary never asked to be remembered. She just asked people to eat, told them it was safe to sleep, asked them not to be afraid in their final moments. And in choosing that over and over, she reshaped history in far larger ways than ever intended. Her story challenges us to ask uncomfortable questions. Who do we punish and why? Who do we abandon when fear dictates policy? And what does it say about a society when care becomes a crime? I'm Brittany Ransom, and this was When Killers Get Caught. Mary Jane Rathbun followed her truth, even when it meant defying the system. And in doing so, she didn't just break the law. She changed it, because the truth always leaves a trail, and sometimes that trail smells like chocolate.